We just created our first custom directive that lets us highlight a specific event based on the value of a flag. If it especially will be with this kind of layout, otherwise it will be just a text. What we want to show you now is what happens to the scope in our application. So in order to do that, I'm going to use the Angular Engine Inspector plugin because it will be very helpful, and I'm going to enable the console as well. So first of all, we want to look at the right column. So we have our root scope, the main scope in Angular, if you remember, is the root scope, the parent of all the scopes. And then we have a for scope underneath it, and if we open the console and I click it, I'll be able to see which element is it binding to. So it's our container, okay? And then we have a set of ngRepeat scope, because as you might have heard already, ngRepeat creates child scope for each one of the elements inside it. So we have all of these scopes, okay? And then inside the ngRepeat, we have our event. So for each event in our main array, in our main collection, we'll have a single event in JSON format, okay? And that's when we do our ngRepeat by typing event in, so it's our key. We have also another scope inside the ngRepeat. We have the ngSwitch one. So also ngSwitch creates its own scope. And that's where we are actually calling our highlight function, if you remember. Let's look at one of the events that has an highlight in it. So if we expand it, we'll have this 34 is the number of the scope, which is our highlight. And now the fun comes. We have a name property inside this child scope, and the name property is actually Sherlock Holmes. Where does it come from? Well, it comes from our directive. So it means that the directive is actually sharing the scope with the parent element in the DOM. So it's really not isolated. It means that it's strictly connected to the DOM, and if the DOM changes, this directive will no longer be valid. If we change anything in our controller, if we are no longer using events but we're using something else, we can't use this kind of directive anymore. So think about a directive that should be reusable across the application and should be agnostic to what happens in the controller. Maybe something that we want to publish on GitHub for other people to use. Well, there's a way around it. And the best way to do so is to define an isolated scope. But let's stick to our current situation. I want to prove you that this directive is still connected to the parent scope. So I'm gonna remove my link function. Actually, I'm just going to comment my assignment. If you remember, I was setting scope.name and I was assigning that to the event name that came from the attribute. And then I was using that in my template to render the directive. But I could have done also something like event.name, and the event is the element we have in the ngRepeat, which is the parent of our ngSwitch scope. So if I save the directive this way, what do you think that will happen in our app? Well, I'm still able to see everything, and if we check again our ng inspector, we have a scope for the ngSwitch as usual, but there's nothing in it. We are simply accessing the ngRepeat scope inside our directive. So again, it's strictly related to the parent right now. So we want instead to isolate our directive so that it will have its own scope. And to do so, we can simply go back to our directive. We will bring back our assignment, and we're going to remove also event dot. And what we're going to do is adding the scope property. So scope, and by typing the two curly brackets, we are deciding that this will be a so-called isolated scope. So let's see what this means. I can still see all of my elements. And let's look at the ng inspector now. We have the ngRepeat scope that contains our child, but you can see that we have another scope with a label next to it, highlight. And that's thanks to ng inspector that recognizes that we have a directive with a highlight name. So we are inside our ngSwitch, we have another scope, the one connected to our directive. But how can we be sure that it's really isolated and cannot access anything outside its own scope? So well, Angular is already giving us an int next to the class we have an ng-isolate-scope, but let's pretend we don't trust it. So let's go back again to our directive and let's try to do what we have done previously. So I'll comment again this assignment and I'll try to access the event.name property like I did before. So what will happen now? Well, as you can see, there's nothing here, just the label. We can't see the event name because now, thanks to the isolated scope, our directive doesn't know anything about what's going on in the outside world. So in this way we have isolated our directive, and inside your isolated scope you can use the so-called local scope properties, and there will be lessons about it later on. I want to show you another thing. Another property you can set is the true property. So if you set your scope to be true, let's see what happens. We can still see the name, so we can still access the outside world. We can still read what's inside our event. But what happens in terms of scopes is that we are forcing the generation of a child scope. So you see, instead of having one scope, we have another one for the directive. But this child scope prototypically inherits from the parent. So it's inheriting everything that is in its parent, while the isolated scope don't know anything about the outside world. So we'll set it back to be an isolated scope. So we'll have our isolated scope with our name and the scope name. But there's something else we have to do if we want this directive to be reusable. And that's what we're going to do in the next lesson.